Hello everybody, and welcome back to this afternoon's sessions. Well, I say this afternoon, depending on where you're watching for. It may be for this morning or evening, but you know what I mean. Welcome back, everybody, anyway, to the second plenary panel of the day. So the showcases have I know just wrapped up, and I really hope that you all enjoyed those. Just a reminder, as there were the 3 showcases which all ran in parallel. So if you wanted to check out either of the 2 showcases that you weren't able to attend, they are all being recorded, or they have all been recorded, and the recordings will be sent, or links to the recordings will be sent out to you via email very shortly. And you can also find them all via our Forum Europe YouTube site. So all of those will be available very shortly. So now on to the next panel, our second panel of the day. So this morning we focused on spectrum and connectivity for verticals, and we're now moving on to look at a different section of the community, I suppose. So we're looking at rural connectivity. So we're now looking at the way in which 5G can help to tackle connectivity not spots. Looking forward to this discussion. We've got an excellent panel once again for you, and I'd like to now invite our moderator for the session, Jeanette Stewart, up to the stage. So Jeanette, hi there. And Jeanette's going to be making an introduction to the topics and then introducing all of our panelists. So Jeanette, looking forward to it, and over to you.
Thanks, Dan, and good day, everybody. Thank you very much for joining this panel session. As Dan has indicated, the session just now is about 5G's enabling role in connecting the not spots, or in rural connectivity. So I'm Jeanette Stewart. I'm a principal and analysis mason, and I'm going to be moderating. I'm going to just say a very few words by way of introduction to this panel, and then we have 5 excellent panelists who will each give their thoughts as well on this important topic. So Dan, could I have the next slide, please? So first of all, I just wanted to say that I think the various forms of lockdown that we've all been in over the last few months have probably brought into sharp focus the benefit and the need, in fact, of having connectivity, not just in cities where we work, but also where we live. And we're using that connectivity for all sorts of virtual experiences, this conference being one, but also for education, homeschooling, for remote working, for downloading films when cinemas are closed, and so forth. So rural connectivity and the not spots really is something that I think has come to the fore over the past few months. There are clearly several benefits, very key benefits, and reasons why high quality coverage is key. Benefits of extending connectivity in the not spots are not just limited to people living and working in rural areas. In fact, there are clearly benefits for rural consumers from having better connectivity, benefits from businesses and enterprises that are located in rural locations. But there's also benefits to wider society, people who are living in cities, who travel to rural areas, but also people who are working in cities who are interacting with businesses also in not spots. And finally, there are potentially benefits as well from operators through having the wider availability of services. There are, however, I think, several well-known challenges as to why some of these not spots do exist. Dan, can I have the next slide, please? So just shown on the slide here is some of the key challenges. Suitable spectrum is something that I think we'll discuss further in this panel. Cost of site deployment is a key issue. Return on investment also is a key issue, and this is probably one of the central themes that we'll be talking about here, that typically these not spots are in areas where there's a very low population density, where there's dispersed populations, where there's difficult terrain. So 5G potentially can enable solutions here, and wireless connectivity traditionally is considered as being suitable to provide connectivity in these rural locations. But nevertheless, there is this fundamental issue about the cost, not just the upfront capital cost, but the ongoing cost of running these networks in rural locations can be very high. So the return on investment, just given the very dispersed populations and the high cost as well, is a key challenge. And then also in rural areas, you have several challenges that are perhaps not so so difficult to solve in the urban areas. So availability of backhaul, the fact that backhaul links are traditionally much longer in rural areas to connect back into the network, availability of power and so forth. So there's a range of challenges that I think we will be talking about more in this panel session. Dan, could I have my next slide, please? So I think one of the key issues that we wanted to focus in on in the remainder of this conversation is how can 5G enable not spots to be connected, and what are some of the solutions that we might think of in Europe to address some of the problems. And I've just shown here some of the possible solution areas. So spectrum, first of all, is a key question. Thinking about making the right spectrum available for rural connectivity, just thinking about the dispersed populations and so forth, and also making the spectrum available under the right conditions. So I'm sure many of us listened in on the panel this morning, which Tony Lavender chaired, when we were talking about spectrum for industrial use. And one of the interesting themes that came out there was spectrum leasing. And I think this is one of the topics perhaps we'll explore in more detail this afternoon, where you don't have usage in the same place all of the time. You know, how can we enable spectrum to be used better? And this applies in the rural areas as well. The potential of possibly bringing in a third party to lease spectrum where it's not being used by the primary provider. Just finally on spectrum, I think we might touch on the types of spectrum. UHF is the obvious candidate for rural connectivity given its reach, but is that the right solution, or are we actually potentially heightening the rural divide by having spectrum which perhaps doesn't offer the full 5G experience in comparison to what you would have in a city if you have 3.5 gigahertz or even millimeter wave connectivity? So how do we sort of address that trade-off? Is it about getting more UHF spectrum, getting the right conditions, or is it actually about trying to push 3.5 gigahertz spectrum a bit further beyond the commercial viability? I think we'll also talk about some of the infrastructure rollout challenges. We'll also talk about how to incentivize that rollout, so coverage obligations to incentivize rollout. We will discuss regulatory solutions, so network sharing, we might talk about the passive sharing, and so deeper levels of sharing. So very much looking forward to discussing this with everybody. I would now like to just introduce our panel. We have 5 panelists, and we will be going through each panelist in the order that they appear in the program. So first of all, our first panelist is Philip Reiderer von Paar. So he is Chief Executive Officer of American Tower Germany. Today he's representing the European Wireless Infrastructure Association. So Philip, I would like to hand over to you.
Janet, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here today and to be part of this very interesting conference. I mean, you have just been highlighting the number of topics which are so critical for us and for Europe going forward. And it's great to see how this format actually seems to work very well. Typically, we would all have been traveling at one place. I do miss not meeting many of you in person, but I do really appreciate the format that we have here, as it makes it possible for all of us to make it happen, to have that dialogue. So as you said, my daily life is actually being CEO of American Tower in Germany, but today I'm representing EVIA, the European Trade Association for Independent Wireless Infrastructure Operators. Dan, if you could go to the next slide, please. We have, when you look at the EVIA, independent, meaning we're not controlled by an MNO or being a JV of an MNO. We have 10 tower company members, active in 11 European markets. In US and Canada, 67% of the radio towers are outsourced by mobile operators to independent players. This is also a major trend globally and an emerging one in Europe, with still modest 21%, but growing. We believe as EVIA that this trend is of benefit for Europe in view of delivering the 5G vision in urban and rural areas, which is what we're talking today. The Commission and many member states have made their mission to make the members of the EU leaders in 5G and the gigabit society. Many member states have also committed themselves to achieving the convergence of living standards throughout the country, with one important element being access to state-of-the-art connectivity without non-spots and without white spots. This will require towers and significantly more towers, a faster rollout and a significant investment. To meet those, we as towercos, independent towercos, bring three things to the table. Our passive wireless infrastructure. The basis for the 5G rollout will mostly be the existing 4G infrastructure. Together, our members have invested over 60 billion of infrastructure assets globally and operate a portfolio of 75,000 towers in Europe. And the numbers are growing daily, literally. Our towers are very often in rural areas, which will be a big factor in the 5G rollout in rural areas, obviously. However, still, Europe needs more radio towers to roll out 5G. Our industry will build towers where there's no tower yet. When the load becomes heavier and heavier, we reinforce the existing structure or rebuild a completely new one. Our industry has been investing into 5G programs for the towers over years. Cost for the deployments will be one of the major issues for the deployment, particularly in the very rural area. Our DNA sharing of infrastructure for all MNOs will be one decisive factor to achieve the necessary savings through productivity and efficiency. If you can go to slide 2, please. Thank you. A higher co-location ratio will support the commercial business case. The more users, the easier amortization of costs will be and provide incentives to also build in more commercially challenging rural areas. EY has found that compared to standalone MNOs and their infrastructure spin-offs or joint ventures, almost twice more customers per site. Combined with operational efficiency and lower cost of capital, this results in much higher efficiency. Ernst Young has estimated this to be around 31 billion euros. If you go to the next slide, please. A second topic that we bring with us is the quick and open access. Independent neutral host infrastructure facilitates competition and allows all players to access the infrastructure easily and quickly. Sharing infrastructure results in fewer barriers to entry or expansion. This encourages smaller wireless operators and innovative new applicants, and this reduces the time to market. The third one is the long-term investment. One thing is for sure, and we have heard it, 5G needs capital and a lot of it. Our members have significant investment capacities and are willing to invest. Investment relief for MNOs could be derived from two sources. Monetizing MNOs' existing asset by outsourcing it to our industry could unlock roughly 28 billion. And if you could go to the next slide, please, here. If the towerco ownership of towers would grow only from 17 to 50%, so still lower than what we see in US and Canada. This money operators could invest into new technology to deploy comprehensive state-of-the-art networks, which is where it all comes nicely together, how we can together drive the market. The new build by independent towercos could result in a similar effect for the required deployment of new towers for 5G in urban and rural areas. Ernst Young again has estimated this benefit to be 31 billion, which I think is a very critical number. The non-spots. The deployment of infrastructure fit for 4G and 5G will be driven by private investment. The MNO's competitors strive for the best networks, like in South Korea, and increased coverage obligation, sometimes 5G specific, sometimes technology agnostic, will see deployments in even more challenging rural areas. New applications like smart farming will require coverage in non-spots, which will allow also, as a side effect, help to cover the not so densely populated areas. If you can go a slide further, please. This is just illustrating how it has been developing in terms of outsourcing to independent towercos in Europe over the last couple of years. And if you go yet one slide further, we have seen that to the three challenges, more towers, fast rollout, and capital, we bring our wireless infrastructure, quick and open access, and our capacity to raise long-term investment. Our members will remain committed to provide the infrastructure for 5G connectivity, also in rural challenging areas, to allow all citizens to the 5G vision. The remaining gap will be closed by government-funded deployment initiatives And I'm happy to share more about that in the panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Philip. I would like to move on to our next panelist, Emilia Ulele, who is Director of the Radio Communications Projects at the National Media and Info Communications Authority in Hungary. So Emilia, looking forward to your perspective on this.
Thank you, Janai. And good afternoon to everyone. And I'm happy to be with you this nice Friday afternoon. And I would share the Hungarian experience. And of course, as a regulator and spectrum manager, I would focus on how we can help the market players, how we can help the market deployment, the 5G deployment. So first of all, I would talk about the successful auction results which happened just during the COVID crisis, and we had a possibility to issue the license. So the next slide, please. I would start our story with the past, of course, because it not just happened right now. Our story started around 2016 when we created the national roadmap. It's coming from the 700 decision of the EU Parliament and the Commission. So we created our roadmap and heavily discussed it with the market players. We have a public consultation twice in that year, just to make a clear vision about our spectrum management and how we imagine when we can issue the suitable spectrum. Yes, we agree, it's one of the key aspects of the 5G development to make available the right spectrum in the right time, in line with the needs of the market. So if you check our plans, we try to harmonize it and fit it to the EU flora. And of course, we could reach a good digital broadcast plan with our neighboring countries, which are not just EU members. So it was very intensive coordination period in our life, but we could reach a good result. And right now, we see how we can start the usage of 700 megahertz band, because we made available the new market for the new players, the 700 megahertz band, and not just 700 megahertz band, but 3.6 was in the package too. So that was the part of our last award. And we work right now on the 900, 1800 renewing. And we had a public consultation just right last year with the 26 gigahertz band. And we see the market players would like to use 26 for point-to-point system, because it's very important to the mobile operators in Hungary for the backhaul system. So it's important for the mobile, but right now they don't want to change the usage for 5G. So we have intensive discussion with them, and we believe the dialogue with the market players. So, but before we can issue the 26 gigahertz for 5G, we need 32 gigahertz make available for point-to-point system. So the next step will be 32, and only after then we can issue the license in 26 gigahertz. Next slide, please. And we are closer and closer to the award results. There is a link, you can find all documents on that. And with the next slide, I would share or thinking about what kind of conditions we thought can help the 5G development. So we decided not creating obligation on 5G. And we had in our mind the technological neutrality. That's why we decided we just would 5G incentives and not obligation. But of course, if there is a statement from the winners, that will be an obligation. So the secondary trading, it's possible. So it can help the verticals, and there is some transition period. So I think they are the main conditions. And with the next slide, I can share, next slide, please. I can share the result from frequency point of view of this award. And I think we reached a good result. You miss 10 megahertz from 700 megahertz band. It's because the governmental policy around PPDR, there is no final decision, but we reserve this for the final governmental decision about the PPDR. Next slide, please. And this is my last and maybe the more complicated slide, because I decided to talk about 5G incentive regime. If you check the groups of the development cases, there are 5 groups. And it's a little bit artificial grouping. Because we wanted to create comparable groups. And you can find settlements there and population coverage of settlements. And it's important because district of Budapest is in the same group than smaller villages. Of course, if some winner decide to cover a district in Budapest, they can choose more villages, small settlements in Hungary. So it's just some guide to the market players to start their development, not just in Budapest, but around smaller villages. And if you check, our target was to reach the governmental aims and policy targets in the digitalization plan. So, of course, tourism is very important, and you can find verticals there. So I think rural area, it's everywhere in all cases. So the market players got the possibility to reduce their cost with this. If they gave that statement, they had a price reduction possibility, and it's longer right now than earlier. So they have a possibility for 10 years to reduce fees with 50%. So that is our help to the market players to reach good 5G coverage everywhere in Hungary until 2025. Thank you.
Thank you, Amelia. That was very helpful. I would now move on to Anne Vanderbroek, please. So Anne is here today representing the European Satellite Operator Association. Anne, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jeanette. I'm equally delighted to virtually be here and welcome you in my house for this topic. The topic of I'm speaking today for the EMEA Satellite Operators Association, and my day job is with a satellite operator, Avanti Communications. The digital divide and addressing hotspots is a very, very important topic for satellite operators. And the map, which we have on the next slide, shows very clearly that this is a very, very difficult challenge. Europe is ambitious. It's ambitious with regard to technology innovation and with keeping up or even leading in the world to bring 5G to European citizens and businesses. But Europe has equally been very ambitious to cover the whole of Europe. And if you look at the map and see what challenges there are in the countries that or the areas that are not in a dark red or orange, which is quite topical for the heat wave we are in. So those areas which are not on the hotspots on this map, they are not necessarily covered by broadband today. Now, that may be today just 3% of households. It is a significant part of Europe. So a significant part of Europe geographically does not have adequate access to broadband, and of course going outside of Europe, where satellite operators equally operate, that problem is just exacerbated. Now the question is, for the question this panel addresses is very, very relevant. Will 5G remedy this issue, and will throwing more spectrum as to 5G be the answer to now bridge this digital divide? Now, as Emilia said, and particularly the first Philip, first speaker said, usually for 5G, the more users there are, the better the economics work out. So, and it was clearly said that if there are a significant uptake in the first wave, then that will create capital to then invest later into rolling out to rural areas. I don't think that's ambitious enough for Europe, particularly since if you look for a solution that is immediately there, that doesn't require additional investment, and which has the reach of the whole of Europe, and in addition doesn't need, but where the incremental cost to add users in thin routes, few users, and users in dispersed location, but that doesn't create an economic conundrum for the operator, then it's clear that satellite has an absolute role to play in the solution. So exactly for the question of economics, I don't think spectrum is the answer. And we can go to the next slide and see how satellite can be part of the solution. Obviously, a lot of us are used to having sports and television delivered by satellite. So having broadband via satellite dish is absolutely a possibility. And well, previously, the technology may have been associated with something that is a little bit more difficult to install, a little bit more clunky, and something which is only for a solution of last resort. It's absolutely important to note that these days, via satellite, there are satellite broadband solutions there who absolutely have the speed and the ease of use, which is associated with other technologies. But further than that, of course, 5G is very much associated with having small, snazzy mobile terminals, which bring kind of mobile communications on steroid. So again, there satellite can equally play a very, very important role in enabling community Wi-Fi, or actually in increasing the reach of mobile operators. So it can do backhaul for mobile operators so that they can connect their towers in a much cost efficient way. and hence the experience for the user is exactly as it is for a 5G mobile operator. It's just the backhaul that is delivered by satellite, completely transparent to the user and the operator. And on satellite community Wi-Fi, that is definitely something where mobile operators increasingly have good experiences with. If we were to sit in the meeting room or in the conference center in Brussels, I could simply ask the question, how many of you are connected now to the internet or to broadband using your mobile phone network, and how many are connected via Wi-Fi? And the answer would obviously be that the vast majority is connected via Wi-Fi. So if you have a mobile and Wi-Fi, and then you have a central satellite dish in a community with a Wi-Fi extension, off you go. It's a seamless internet connection. So satellite is in itself a solution, but it's also an enabler to increase the reach of other solutions. And coming to our last point I wanted to make, if we need some evidence to demonstrate that satellite gives the same user experience as other technologies, this is a very recent study that brings home that if you look at the top 10 usages of satellite networks, it is no different than it is over other technologies. So the business use, the residential use, the entertainment use of citizens and businesses in Europe can totally adequately be satisfied over a satellite solution. And to conclude, I have meticulously avoided to the last slide, please, to use the S word, the spectrum word, and of course it all relates back to that. Europe has identified bands for 5G. It has identified satellite bands, and we in order to address a leveling solution where all citizens and all households, wherever they are in Europe, have access to a same experience and good broadband, we need to look at 5G wider than just a mobile solution. We need to look at it as a network of networks where satellite is fully embedded, plays its different roles where it's good at. At the moment, there are already platforms being built to integrate mobile and satellite technologies to make it a seamless solution for the user, and standardization activities are underway. So this is no longer a dream. This is really something that is a technological reality. So in sum, it isn't spectrum that is the answer to giving more spectrum for the same users who already are very well connected is not the solution. It is having adequate bands and the right spectrum for the mix of users and users that will constitute 5G as a network of networks and actually solve the digital divide rather than enlarge it.
Thank you, Anne. So could I move on now to Carlos Soto, who is Senior Manager, Group Market Structure and Network Policy Group for Vodafone. Carlos, over to you.
Sorry, Carlos, I think you're on mute. Do you want to just unmute yourself?
Oh, sorry about that.
No worries. Yeah. Go ahead. Okay.
Yeah, sorry. So thanks, Annette. So good afternoon, and I guess good morning for some. My name is Carlos Soto, and I work in Vodafone Group's Policy and Public Affairs team, and I focus on kind of network policy and spectrum options. So many of us are fortunate to have good connectivity, and during the crisis, we've been able to work from home, be in touch with friends and family, and access online entertainment. But for many people, poor connectivity has actually been a source of additional stress and anxiety over the past few months. So I guess with that in mind, it's not surprising that a focus for policymakers going forward is going to be to address coverage and address connectivity. But having said that, the economics of extending coverage remain the same, and this was already kind of touched on by Jeanette and Philippe. And it is, these areas, they tend to be more expensive, and there are fewer sources of revenue with which to pay for the infrastructure, right? So we're generally talking about investments that potentially have a negative return on investment. Furthermore, as was mentioned in the first session on Tuesday, we're a sector that has a sort of chronically low return on capital. And we have significant expenditures coming up from the spectrum auctions, and also the need to upgrade our networks to 5G. So, we have very little capacity to kind of internally subsidize these projects, which again have a negative return. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean that these goals can't be achieved. They just need to a rethinking of the policy. And here I would sort of highlight three policies or three changes that can make a significant difference. So firstly, I think we need to work together to lower the cost structure of the sector. And specifically, this means embracing sharing, and Philip sort of touched on this already. And, this should be done with all the competition considerations and potential limitations, but this has the potential to really change the economics of the sector and, for example, accelerate the rollout of 5G and make it easier to roll out in rural areas. And if it's done well, it shouldn't have a negative effect on competition. So secondly is, if the objective is to address the digital divide, then policy should be consistent with this. So forcing in new entrants with preferential conditions, including reserving the type of spectrum that can be used to deploy in rural areas, without any obligation or expectation that they will have to do so, does absolutely nothing to achieve this goal. And finally, there will always be areas where it will not be economically feasible to invest, even if it's socially desirable. And here's where the state has to step in and sort of provide subsidies and help to kind of make the investment happen. Now, can these objectives not be achieved with coverage obligations? So coverage obligations are a sort of kind of obvious policy tool, but they're a bit blunt and they have their issues. They can distort auctions, so the way the spectrum is actually assigned. They can actually be expensive because there's an implicit subsidy there. They can sometimes be inefficient. And because what we're trying to do now is to address this really expensive part, the really uneconomic part, it is possible that in some cases coverage obligations might not be able to achieve the objective. Now, thankfully, there are countries that are rethinking how to approach this problem. And in particular, I'd like to highlight Germany and the UK. So in Germany, for example, and this is before the current stimulus package, a package of 1.1 billion euros was approved to build up to 5,000 rural sites to extend rural coverage. I think the target is 99.95% of households and 97.5% of the landmass. And this package also includes measures to make it easier to get approval for building new towers, which again, this ties up with the thing about changing the cost structure of the sector. And there's also kind of the sharing proposal to potentially share up to 6,000 rural sites. Now, the UK is actually a great example of how much better it could be with a sort of new approach. So, kind of the original approach in the UK was kind of, follow the normal blueprint, which was to coverage obligations in the auction. And this had sort of its known issues, potential risk of leading to a misallocation of spectrum, and that actually the policy goal wouldn't be achieved in full if both coverage obligations weren't solved. So this led to operators and government kind of sitting down together and working and thinking about a joint scheme that works for everyone. This is what's called, I think, the single rural network. And under this scheme, overall coverage and individual coverage will be extended through MNO investment to increase sharing, and additional investment by government to help build additional rural sites. So this is the sort of thing that, it's a win-win for everyone. So for government and for Ofcom, it goes above the kind of the original policy goal. So before, I think the overall goal was, 2 coverage obligations of 90%. And I think maximum coverage of 92% for at least one operator. I think now it's going to be, so coverage of all operators is going to be at least 88%, I think, going from 66%. And then coverage by at least one operator is going to be 95%. So you go beyond that, beyond kind of the original objective, potentially even at a lower cost and without distorting the spectrum assignment. For us, it sort of makes it viable for us to actually make the investments in these networks. And for people in rural areas in the UK, that means that they will have better coverage, and they'll have more choice because more MNOs will be providing the coverage. So I guess just to kind of wrap up, I think the question is not where policymakers should aim to address kind of connectivity in rural areas. I think we're kind of past this discussion, and certainly after the crisis that's become clear. I think it's more about, what are the sort of policies that are actually going to deliver on this. So thank you.
Great, Carlos, thank you very much. And finally, Richard Marsden, Managing Director from Neda Economic Consulting. Richard, welcome, and over to you.
Thanks, Jeanette. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been based in the United States for the last 10 years, so it's a pleasure to be participating in the European conference without having to jump on an aeroplane. I wanted to use my minutes to bring an economist's perspective to the question of extending coverage, and I'm going to hit some of the same points that Carlos has just been speaking about. The main argument I'm going to make is that tying onerous obligations to spectrum in auctions probably should be the last resort, sort of the last tool the policymaker pulls out of the toolbox, not, as it tends to be at the moment, the first one. I think we can all agree, based on what everyone's been saying today and more generally, that extending rural coverage is a really good thing. We would all like to see that happen. And there's no shortage of providers out there who are willing to do this. There's lots of companies out there with innovative solutions for bringing coverage, whether that involves satellite or new platforms like HAPS. That's great. The fundamental problem, as Carlos has flagged, and satellite flagged, is it's expensive, and many of these areas just aren't economic to cover. So if society wants to cover those areas, then we need money to do that, and inevitably some of that money will have to come from government and from taxpayers. Therefore, we should be razor focused on finding lower cost, high value solutions for this and trying to find the best way of covering, whether that's mobile or whether that's some other solution, and how many operators that involves, etc. Now, coverage obligations, as Carlos has said, look superficially really rather an attractive option to mobile operators. But I think the thing to remember is that ultimately someone's paying, and actually it's usually the government that ends up paying. If we're in a competitive auction world, then what will happen is you would expect the value of the licenses to be depressed, operators to pay less. So ultimately the government's paying anyway, it's just hidden. Now that's not always the case, it's complicated, but the general gist is you've got to pay anyway. Moreover, spectrum and coverage are very different things. They're not the same. And when you lump them together, what you're effectively creating is a new product to be sold in an auction, which is a spectrum coverage amalgam. And that has potential for rather poor outcomes in an auction setting. Obvious problem, you're potentially unnecessarily limiting the pool of bidders that can compete for that product. So let's say, as Carlos just said, that the best solution for mobile coverage is to bring together a consortium of mobile operators, perhaps pooling their spectrum or at least pooling infrastructure in certain rural areas. Well, for obvious reasons, spectrum auctions generally prohibit those kind of consortia from bidding for spectrum together because of competition concerns. So we might be precluding that solution straight off, at least within the framework of the auction. Then if there are other providers out there who think they could use the spectrum better and perhaps link up with mobile later, well, they may simply not be good people to bid for mobile spectrum. They're going to lose that, so they can't actually express their value for the coverage. Which leads us to the second general problem, which is the most efficient winner of the spectrum and the most efficient provider to deliver the coverage obligations may well not be the same person, the same group, whether that's the wrong mobile operator or the wrong other type of provider. There's also all sorts of awkward questions that it throws up when you try and sell them together, which is, well, how many operators do you need to provide the obligation? If you put the obligations on all mobile operators, well, will that lead to wasteful duplication of the coverage? But if you limit the obligation to one operator, will that mean that you don't actually get the full benefits of this coverage extension because many people can't use it, which then leads to further issues like, do you need to mandate roaming and these types of issues? So what other models should we reach to first? Well, I'd like to highlight a couple of examples. One Carlos already just mentioned, which is the idea of industry-wide negotiations. So we have the Shared Rural Network in the UK, which the UK government is pumping in about £500 million into, and I think the mobile operators are putting up about £500 million themselves. And that's going to extend coverage to entirely new areas, as well as improve poorly covered areas where maybe only one operator is at present, and more can be done there. So that's bypassing the auction altogether, but it's bringing together the operators, and because they're working together, they can reach more areas efficiently themselves, and the government gets the maximum bang for its buck. I think a second approach, which is really worth thinking about, is reverse subsidy auctions. Ultimately, if you're going to have to pay for coverage, you want to try and get a competitive process to identify the lowest cost solution that can deliver sufficient quality. And there's a massive process about to happen here in the United States, which is the RDOF process, where the federal government has allocated $16 billion to cover unserved and poorly served regions of the United States. It's technology neutral. There's expected to be many bidders for that, and we'd expect that to drive the competitive price down. So, all of that said, it may simply be the case in some countries that the government coming up with money independently to subsidize coverage is politically difficult. So, in some countries, we have the problem that the regulators are mandated to extend coverage, but the only source of money they have coming in is the money from spectrum auctions. Well, if that's the case, if you're really limited in that straitjacket, then a good solution might be to sell spectrum in one stage of an auction and procure coverage in a second stage of the auction using those proceeds. So it's all one process, so that you never have to leak the money out to the Treasury and try and get it back, but at least you're you're selling and procuring separately, so you're not creating a combined product. Now, there are limitations there. It might be that in some countries you can't actually have people get more money than you receive. There are ways economists can do that, such as vouchers. I won't go into the detail of that, but there are a lot of solutions out there. So really, at the end of the day, it should only be the last resort, I think, to attach the coverage obligations directly, onerous coverage obligations, I should say, directly to the spectrum. And I think it would be great to see more regulators exploring these other options first and being a bit more upfront if they're ultimately pumping for coverage obligations and saying why they feel that's the only route available to them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Some very interesting perspectives there. Could I just very quickly summarize while I think Dan will bring everybody else back up onto your screen. So I had written down sort of 4 key themes here. Lowering the cost structure, I think, is a key theme that you talked about. How the spectrum is assigned, what spectrum, and the structure of any obligations. And Richard, you've raised some very interesting points there about sort of decoupling the spectrum assignment process from, you know, the policy challenges of rural coverage. So that's something else we might talk about. Government subsidies clearly is one further point. And then finally, I think we might talk about sort of what the rural connectivity ideally looks like. You know, we know what 5G looks like in urban areas. What will it look like in rural areas? And how do we bring all the different actors together? So you know, it's been very neatly described here. You know, you've got the mobile operators, you've got satellite companies, you've got independent tower companies, you've got other third parties as well. How do we bring all this together? So I think those are some of the key points. Just for the panelists, though, I think the first thing we will talk about is the results of the audience poll. So thank you very much to the audience who have voted on our poll. So the poll was, what are the biggest challenges impacting ability to extend 5G coverage? And we gave you 5 options, so spectrum and licensing frameworks, backhaul availability and fibre rollout, cost and site acquisition timescales, business case was the 4th one. And then we gave you an option E, which was something else. And we said, please state, if you think it's something else, please state it in the comments box. Now, actually, I'm pleased to say, just for simplicity, that nobody voted for E. maybe that was certainly makes my life a lot easier not having to read all the different comments. So we had no votes for E, so that's great. We had an overwhelming 49% saying that the business case is the key challenge. And I think this probably points to what everybody has been talking about here about so not just lowering the cost structure, I think, but it's also thinking about maybe the what the demand side looks like in rural areas and sort of trying to sort of aggregate that demand together. So 49% for the business case, 13% voted for the cost of site acquisition and the lengthy processes. So Philip, I think you mentioned that. Backhaul availability and fibre rollout, 20%. Spectrum licensing came in at 18%. So I think there was an overwhelming majority there in relation to the business cases. So I wonder, first of all, just before we have further comments and questions from the audience, can I hear your reactions to, first of all, that poll result, and then secondly, anything else you want to just pick up on from what the other panelists have said? So Philip, perhaps back to you as the first speaker.
All right. Okay. Thanks, John. So looking at the poll results, I don't think I'm extremely surprised. Ultimately, it is, of course, around the business case that all need to make. And Richard, I loved your comment. Ultimately, someone is paying, and that is just simply applicable for everything. When the state is paying, it's ultimately the taxpayer. So it's always that. So we need to get a business case running. And then I actually think if we all sit together, we can get a business case running. There are different aspects when you look at the other poll feedbacks. I mean, the backhaul availability, fiber rollout, I guess, and that you love that point because it's one of course your pitches here. Whereas the spectrum and licensing framework got 18% here, and costly and lengthy acquisition. I guess we all feel in a way these things can be overcome if we work together, and the most prominent ones are the business case and actually connecting the site. And I would, I think, for Evir and the members, subscribe to that.
Thank you, Philip. So Amelia, just moving on to you then, presumably this is no surprise as well. I mean, you mentioned in your presentation the different policy goals that you've been thinking about, and not just rural, but also connecting roads, connecting rail and so forth. So what's your reaction?
Yes, I would share Richard's voice. Yeah, it's not a surprise that business case needed at first. And if we look our past, when we issued license for 3G or 4G, we look for killer application or the other business cases. So it's, I think, nothing new. Again, we have the newest technology with more possibilities, and we don't know how the future service will look like by that platform. So that's why it was hard to us as a regulator to create good targets and try to influence the market players' decision, the M&M's decision. So I'm happy that spectrum and licensing framework is just 18%. So it means maybe it's not too important, or if we do it well. So thank you for that opinion. And the backhaul availability, I mentioned 26 gigahertz and 32 in Hungary. It's important, but not the most. It's not the priority in Hungary too. So I think that's all from my side.
Thank you, Amelia. So moving on to Anne, what's your thoughts on what you've heard?
It's very heartening that there starts to be an understanding out there that just throwing more spectrum at one technology, mobile technology, is really not the solution to this. What it really needs to address the economics of the business case is to have the right mix of technology in the different areas. And the mix of technology in a rural area will be different than the mix of technology in an urban area, for sure. But taking spectrum away in C-band and in Ka-band from satellite operators to give it to mobile operators, rob Peter to pay Paul, is just going to exacerbate the business case for. It's not going to solve the business case problem. It needs cross-sectoral collaboration on here. And when there is state subsidies, that is probably one thing that needs to address more and realized more, is that when there are voucher schemes, that this should be truly technology neutral and also accessible for satellite technology. So yes, I think we are very, very coherent in the views in the panel and with the audience. So yeah, it's good to hear.
Thank you, Anne. So Carlos, anything you wanted to add?
I think it sort of ties up with what I said. It's again, the cost structure. And I think there's actually a bit of overlap between the different themes. So if you think about things like costly, lengthy site acquisition, that is also part of the cost structure of the sector, right? So there are places, for example, we face restriction in terms of tower heights, and that's going to make rural rollout more expensive, or getting permits. And again, coming back to the example of Germany, it was not just the money; it was also changing kind of these rules for how sites can be built and make it a bit more easy. So, it's I don't think it's like this or that solves the problem. I think there's quite a few things that need to be addressed.
Thank you, Carlos. And Richard, finally, any further thoughts from you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all about the spectrum licensing frameworks. We could have a bit more flexibility so that it's easier for operators to work together or to lease spectrum to other parties. But that is basically about finding efficient ways to spend the money, and then other things like backhaul and site acquisition will largely fall into place.
Thank you very much, Richard. So I think we've got time now for a few questions from the audience. So if I can just pick up, first of all, a question for the panel from Ian Marshall from Rucus. We've heard promises of solving rural connectivity and removing NOT spots from the MNOs throughout the evolution of mobile technology, in fact, 2G through to 5G. Why does the panel believe that 5G will succeed where earlier technologies have not? So, I mean, interesting question. Could we maybe start, Philip? You did mention 4G as the basis of 5G. Do you want to pick up on this question first of all, and then we can maybe move on? Carlos, clearly you'll have a perspective on this as well.
Sure, I can try. I would have thought it was like the perfect question for Carlos as an operator. But looking at this from the passive infrastructure side, I think two aspects to things, or probably even three key ones. Number one is, over the past years, and I think in particular also recently in the last even probably 24 months or so, we as Europe have seen that we need to sort of take a step forward, a noticeable step forward, if you want to be a strong region. And a strong region includes many aspects, but in particular, and that is nothing I need to say here, but it's connectivity. And the connectivity that we talk about globally is now in the future 5G. At least when it comes to all the bandwidths, etc., that we need. I would even go probably as far that the end user doesn't care whether it's called 5G or 4G, but he needs the capacity and the speed and the ping and all of that one. And that is also critical for the manufacturing. So we need to see that in Europe, we get that in place, and factories are not in the city centers, they're outside of the city centers. Offices are a mix, but people live, and we want the greatest people in Europe. We want great living standards. We want great companies. So we need to, and I think that's something which every single country in Europe and Europe together as the European Union saw, we need to do something. So I think that is one change already. A second one then goes where we see, wow, there's a big investment need, and this investment need is just so obvious right now. So we need to do something different. And this is where probably many of the players who we have here on the podium come together. We as EVIA can contribute and say we have the investment capabilities, we can bring sites, we can invest into sites, and we see the trend, and that is where I think it might address this point, that the operators in Europe are opening up more to outsourcing their towers and selling it and opening up towards neutral hosts, neutral tower codes. And that, if you go that path further, it will help. Ultimately, the business case needs to work. And that is, of course, Carlos, where I look to you, because you have then the end users in your network. You need to also be able to justify a business case. But I believe if our companies and others work together, then there's a good reason. And I think there's a big push for all of us to do it now.
Thank you, Philip. So Carlos, over to you.
So I guess what I would say first, is that the technology itself by itself doesn't solve the problem, right? It means that it's type of service that you get once you have coverage, once you have a signal. It is different, but 5G by itself doesn't solve it. What solves it is the infrastructure that you need to build in order to get that signal, right? And that sort of goes back to, again, this issue, So it's not a 4G, 5G issue. It's about how do you build the infrastructure that you need in order to be able to provide people the service, right? And, given that, again, we're talking about uneconomic areas, what are the sort of things that governments and policymakers need to do in order to make this happen, right?
Sure. Okay. Well, let's come back. Sorry, Richard, do you want to?
Well, I was just going to say, I think the question is a little bit unfair, because the reality is that society's expectations of what mobile operators deliver just continue to move forward, and we're far from having a finishing goal. What mobile operators delivered is far, far better than what they were delivering 5 years ago. It takes time and it takes money. And I think we have to recognise that this will be a moving target for a long time in the future. We're going to be talking this very same and then new higher level in 5-10 years' time.
Yes, thank you, Richard. That was actually a point that I had in my mind as well. That I think one of the challenges here is that the customer experience of mobile is increasing all the time, especially in urban areas when we see the rollout of 3.5 gigahertz and millimeter wave, and you have a real differential potentially between what 5G offers in urban areas versus 4G. In rural areas, I wonder, how do we achieve that full 5G, or indeed should we be doing that? Is it actually about getting the best mobile broadband coverage, or do we actually, have to have this full 5G everywhere? And indeed, if we are, how are we going to do that? And I think this is a key challenge that, as you say, Richard, the expectation that everybody has of mobile is just increasing as you get the rollout in urban areas. So, Carlos, just coming back to you again, I wonder if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I guess the first thing is, the physics of spectrum are what they are, right? And, the difference between 700 and 3.6, in terms of propagation are what they are. My understanding is that if you were going to have, the same coverage with 3.6 versus 700, you're potentially talking about around the order of 5 to 10 times as many sites, right? I think the second thing is, in terms of actual user experience, so real life user experience, if there's a 5G 700, potentially 800 site, that is used by a few people, is that going to be materially different from someone in an urban area who might be connected to 3.6, but many more people are using the site? Is that going to be materially different? But I think the other thing that I would add is, again, if you change the economics of the sector, a lot of these deployments at the moment don't make absolutely any sense to deploy 3.6. All of a sudden become reasonable, right? Because now the economics have changed. Now you can split the cost between different MNOs, and now it sort of makes sense. So you potentially have the potential to kind of, if this is really necessary, to kind of just push that to many more areas.
Yeah. Anne, what you were going to comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to add 3 points. The first point is to Philip's point. You just said if everybody here on the panel and our sectors and operators work together, we can do it. I can give you my number. Actually, let's start and do it. The second thing I wanted to say is that users have reached a certain price point. They are not going to pay extra for infotainment, or they're not going to pay extra for connected cars if that doesn't work everywhere. So having in one go rather than a two-phase approach to 5G and having a one-phase approach by integrating satellite will actually improve the business case overall very much. And the third point I wanted to make is that there have been, and Jeanette, you said it very well in the beginning, there have been really interesting discussions during this conference on the verticals. So there are verticals in rural areas with very, very specific needs. E-agriculture. So there is need to not have define 5G as one fit for all. 5G is different than 4G on steroids. It's a network of networks. The economics are different. The verticals are more important, and satellite is part of the mix. I need to say that.
Thank you, Anne. We have several questions actually about the related to sort of government subsidy, but also broadly about the structure of what we should be thinking about in rural areas. So first of all, one of the questions we've got is about how best to address not spots. Should a neutral host model be considered for these not spots where coverage speeds are low, possibly run by an MNO, but at arm's length? Or indeed, should we be thinking of another type of model like a independent tower company or even another third party? People's views on that? Carlos, did you have a comment?
I mean, I guess. I mean, my question would be, if you have a sort of, again, coming back to the UK model where you have kind of MNOs kind of building and sharing the infrastructure in this rural network, mm-hmm. What is sort of the thing that a neutral host does that is not currently done, right? So I guess I haven't thought about all the possible permutations, but I mean, this sort of idea of a neutral host tends to come up as, this is the solution to a problem, and I'm not quite sure that in itself solves the problem. The neutral host in itself has kind of the incentive to build in these sort of areas, right? Does that make sense?
Yes, well, I mean, it's interesting because in the UK, actually, and apologies to focus on the UK, but in the UK, we do actually have two slightly different models. So we have the shared rural network, which you've described there, which is the UK government initiative with the 4 MNOs and the government is providing some funding, and as so are the MNOs. But also there is the in Scotland specifically, there is what's called the 4G infill, which is about addressing 4G not spots in Scotland. And actually that is a different model. That is the Scottish Government providing funding to a tower company, in fact, who is building the infrastructure, and then that tower company then enters into market agreements with the MNOs to use that infrastructure. So even within the UK, we have these two different models.
And that's actually good, but that's more of a sort of passive infrastructure kind of solution. My understanding is that it's similar, for example, in Germany with the passing. I mean, the towers themselves can be built by MNOs, but potentially could also be built by a tower. Because I think Philip knows this much better than me. So I mean, there is a sort of question about, let's say, procurement, about who builds the infrastructure and how it's built. But the way, I mean, maybe my understanding of the neutral host, and maybe the person who asked the question had a sort of a different view, is this is someone who sort of runs the network and sort of provides kind of a capacity to the operators. And again, I don't know if that aspect itself really solves the problem itself.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah. So, Philip, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I wanted to say something because there are, I think, a couple of connections also to the last point. still. Will we get 5G? Again, to my point, honestly, we need the best connectivity and the highest speed, whether 5G, 4G, 6G will also come. They talk about it. So we need that. We have a tendency, maybe it's just around Germany, but I think if I also look at recent developments, that people are demanding things, but they don't want to see it. You know, that's also around the permitting. Yes, like I want to have a mobile network, but I don't want to see an antenna anywhere. But that there needs to be some acceptance, and I think the states have recognized it much more than in the past, also to take their share in educating the market. Why do we do it? Not only speaking about the pains. Yes, gosh, it doesn't look nice, and we don't. Well, I agree on that. We all agree on that one, I assume. But there's so much benefit for everyone here, for the whole society, if we have connectivity. And maybe the self-driving car, which where you can again question for whom is that a benefit, but all the way down to health and all of these topics. There's so much social benefit if we have these networks. So I think there's a good reason, and the states have invested or have put funds aside. And I can tell you in Germany, then we have actually two funds which have been defined lately. One is a program around 1.1 billion euro that the state is going to spend on 4G coverage in white spots, which is what in this discussion we call non-spots. But white spot, it takes a long to discuss also what is a white spot, because everyone seems to have a different read on that one. They have yet just 2 weeks back decided on one further program around 5 billion euros to get 5G coverage across Germany for everyone. Now, you can take from it, there is something that the state wants to do. Does the state want to be an operator? I doubt it. I would probably also doubt that in this forum or concept we would say, hey, it should be the state, or that probably none of us would have an interest here or there to do it. Should just one operator be the host for all others? It could work. I mean, yes, it could be an option. Should it be a neutral host? And then it is exactly to define what is the neutral host. Are they just providing the passive infra? Carlos, like you were saying, this is what we do in Germany. We have the towers across the country, and then we have the operators on them. Would it be an option to actually say, well, you know what? You operators have to agree on one technology provider. We put them on our cost, and we just lease it out to you on whatever commercial model. I guess these things can be discussed. The ultimate question is, are we all willing to do it? And if at the end of the day, one of the parties says, no, you know, I want it for myself, and I want to be the lead and everything, then we get to a problem. But if we actually agree, yes, we need it everywhere, let's utilize the investment capabilities and capacities which are there, then let's utilize all of those. And I mean, I shared some numbers earlier, what can be utilized in addition. So I think there is a path to do more, and then whether it's a neutral host operator or another model, I mean, these things can be fine. They can, if you all want, we can find solutions.
Yeah, I think there are some technical challenges which I didn't want to get into to do with building 5G on top of 4G, where you've got multiple vendor solutions and things like that. So yeah, hopefully that will be addressed. Emilia, I wondered your perspective on this as a regulator. You know, should we be aiming for one network in a rural area, or is that concerning? Is choice something that you know, is as important in rural as it is everywhere else? What's your thoughts on this?
If you could check my notes, I wrote some keywords, and one of it is competition and polling. So in Hungary, when we issued the 800 megahertz license in 2014, after that, two operators had a secondary trading agreement, and on the basis they made a polling model. So they had 20 megahertz wide channel in 800 megahertz band. But the third party, the Vodafone, challenged it, and there is no competition authority decision until this time. So it's hard to make a decision from regulatory perspective that sharing and polling it's good or not. And if we check the the aim of competition, infrastructure competition and service-based competition, which is more important. It's hard to make a decision right now. In the code, the infrastructure competition is important, the most important thing right now. So it means, of course, if there is a sharing, it will be maybe faster development. And if the owner of that network share the results, its results, it can be useful, the whole market. So I think for a user, it's not important whose network is there. They would like to get a good quality service. That's why I agree with Philip that education it's very important, because our users don't know which frequency the equipment using and which technology behind it. So I think they need a real good quality service with good throughput. And one possible way, yes, it's the sharing and the pooling, but I'm not sure from competition side this is the best solution.
Noted. Okay, thank you very much. So I think we're going to just move on to conclusions. I think there's one very quick question, Richard. It's got your name written on it as an economist. Do you suggest that governments are going to have to subsidise industry rollout in perpetuity? Any quick thoughts? We've got about 2 minutes.
Well, perpetuity is a long time. I would, the economics of coverage are changing. There are new solutions emerging. Might be that in the future, which can actually provide ubiquitous coverage at a reasonable standard, could be provided fairly cost effectively without subsidy. I think at the moment that's not the case, and money is needed if we want to continue the pace of coverage. But there's no reason to assume it will be perpetuity. Things change, and I think regulators need to stay on top of those dynamics, and operators certainly will.
Thank you, Richard. So I would just like to thank everybody very much for your participation. Please do join us in the next session. There's a Have Your Say session where I'm sure we will recap on the conclusions from here, and also the related topic we had this morning in relation to the vertical connectivity. So thank you very much, everybody. I believe Dan will be joining us again. Dan, are you?
Hello, yeah, I'm back. So yeah, just to add to that, Jeanette, thank you very much. And to all of our panelists, yeah, thank you very much. Another really interesting panel. Lots of good discussion, lots of comments and questions from the audience as well. So thank to everyone out there for those. And yeah, sorry we couldn't get around to all of them. But as Jeanette says, we do now have the Have Your Say session. So for those of you who were, I saw there was some good discussion going on in the chat room alongside the panel. So for those of you who are commenting, those of you who had questions that we didn't get around to bringing up in the panel itself, please do come and join us now in the Have Your Say session. So once again, a reminder, the Have Your Say session is going to cover both this panel and also the earlier panel today on connecting vertical industries. So if you've got any thoughts, any comments, anything to add, any conclusions for any of those panel, then please do come and join us for that. You'll have the chance to bring your audio and your video feed live, to come live up onto the stage, to join with Jeanette and also with Tony Lavender, who moderated this morning's sessions, to have a discussion with them on what you think of the outcomes for the session. So you need to go to the Sessions tab on the left-hand side of your menu bar, and then go into the Have Your Say session in there, navigate your way to there. And then if you want to be brought live, please do request to bring your audio and video feed live, hit the blue button, and we'll bring you up and look forward to hearing from you there. So in the meantime, once again, Jeanette, thank you very much. All of our panelists, thank you very much. That was a really, really interesting discussion. And yeah, looking forward to seeing everyone over in the Have Your Say room in just a couple of seconds. Thank you.